Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going deep, really deep, into the power crisis that's got Cuba in the dark.
Yeah.
Yeah, an entire island's basically been plunged into darkness. It's the worst blackout they've seen in decades,
Yeah.
and we're going to try to unpack exactly what's going on. We've got a whole stack of news articles here from, like, Al Jazeera,
Hmm.
The Guardian, The New York Times, you name it, so we can get a real, on-the-ground look at the situation.
It's definitely a situation that highlights how vulnerable Cuba's energy system really is
For sure.
and how reliant they are on, certain resources, even more so than blackouts that have happened before.
Right, right. And it looks like, what actually triggered this particular blackout is pretty straightforward, right? It's the
What?
Antonio Guiteras power plant, the biggest one in Cuba that just went kaput.
Yeah, that's right. The plant was actually undergoing maintenance, after running all summer nonstop to keep up with the demand. So, it was already under a lot of stress. And when it collapsed, that created a ripple effect, which took down the whole grid.
Wow, so it's like this one power plant was the one thing holding everything together. And when it went down, everything went down with it.
Exactly. It shows just how fragile their electricity system is because they depend so heavily on this single plant.
Right.
And of course, that's all connected to their energy mix overall, which is,
Yeah,
hmm
not great. El País is reporting that Cuba gets something like 83% of its energy from petroleum, another 12% from natural gas, and then less than 5% from renewables? I mean, how did it get to this point?
Well, there are a few historical reasons. So for a long time, Cuba depended on these subsidized oil imports from Venezuela. And this created this reliance on fossil fuels that really discouraged them from investing in renewables.
So they kind of got stuck in this system that makes
Yeah.
them like super vulnerable to anything happening outside of Cuba.
Exactly. And this vulnerability has long-term consequences. It's not just, shortages they're exposed to or price changes and stuff. It's also the environment, right? All these fossil fuels have a big impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And, reading through these news reports, it's hard not to think about the human cost of all this. The New York Times, for example, has this story about an 81-year-old woman who's, like, racing to cook her frozen chicken before it goes bad. And El País talks about families that can't cook at all because they have no gas.
Yeah. Yeah. It paints a very clear picture of how disrupted daily life is. Hospitals struggling to keep equipment running, food spoiling, people, trying to improvise to cook. It's a tough situation.
It sounds almost like stepping back in time. And you can really sense the frustration in these reports, right? Global News even mentioned people banging pots and pans in protest.
Yeah, it's clear this blackout has ignited some unrest. It's not the first time we've seen this, though.
You're thinking of those protests back in 2021? Those were also sparked by blackouts, weren't they? Al Jazeera had a lot of coverage on that.
Exactly. And those protests, they revealed these underlying social and economic tensions that have been brewing for years in
Yeah.
Cuba. And this current blackout, well, it's tapping into that same well of discontent.
Right, right. And then you have President Diaz-Canel showing up in military uniform, issuing warnings about unrest, according to the South China Morning Post. It's kind of unsettling.
Definitely. It's a clear signal that the government is worried about things escalating and that they're prepared to get tough on any protests. But it is interesting to see how the blame game is already starting.
Oh, yeah. I've seen that in France 24. And Al Jazeera, actually. A bunch of sources are reporting that the Cuban government is pointing the finger at the U.S. embargo, saying it's making their energy problems even worse.
Right, which raises the question, how much is the embargo really to blame and how much is due to Cuba's own internal policies?
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
And it's easy to get lost in the politics of it all.
It is, but I think it's important to look at both sides and encourage our listeners to think critically. We need to understand how external pressures and internal factors all kind of came together to create this crisis.
Yeah, so it's not a black and white situation. There are a lot of nuances here, and each listener will have to, weigh the different perspectives and come to their own conclusions.
Exactly. But I think to really understand how Cuba got to this point, we need to go back in time a little bit.
That's a great point. To understand how they got here, we need to, rewind the clock a bit.
Yeah, because Cuba's energy story is deeply intertwined with its political and economic journey. Yeah, Cuba's energy landscape has been shaped a lot by its relationship with the Soviet Union, especially during the Cold War.
Oh, yeah, that's a period of history with so many consequences, even today. I'm ready to connect those dots back to Cuba.
Okay, well, before the revolution in 1959, American companies actually controlled a big chunk of Cuba's energy sector, but then when Fidel Castro came to power and sided with the Soviets, well, everything changed.
So instead of relying on the U.S. for energy, they switched to the USSR.
Basically, yeah. The Soviets became their main supplier of oil, and they gave it to them at these really low prices, which helped keep their economy afloat. They even helped build some of the big power plants in Cuba, some of which are still running today.
Those are the same aging power plants we were talking about before, right? The ones that are super inefficient and tough to maintain.
Exactly. They were built using Soviet technology, which was pretty advanced back then, but now it's just outdated.
And I bet getting replacement parts for those plants is a real pain.
You got it. Maintaining those plants has become a huge challenge, and it's expensive. But the biggest turning point came when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s.
That must have been a huge blow to Cuba. They suddenly lost their cheap oil and all that technical support. What did they do?
Well, Cuba went into what they called the special period. It was a time of really extreme economic hardship. Fuel shortages became the norm, and blackouts were happening all the time.
So you could say that the roots of this energy crisis go all the way back to that time.
Yeah, you could definitely say that. It forced Cuba to adapt. They had to look for other sources of energy. They explored biofuels, wind power, and even started investing in solar. But progress was slow, and it wasn't easy.
It seems like they were trying to break out of this cycle of dependence, but it was just too hard.
It was. And then in the late 2010s, the U.S. tightened the embargo under the Trump administration, and that put even more strain on Cuba's economy. It limited their access to global markets and financing, making it even tougher for them to upgrade their energy systems.
So it was a whole bunch of things that came together: historical circumstances, political changes, and outside pressure.
Yeah, exactly. All these factors have led to where they are now with this blackout, and it's really exposed the systemic problems with Cuba's energy sector.
But even with all these challenges, there are some hopeful signs, right? We talked about Cuba trying to develop renewable energy and those community-based initiatives. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, those smaller scale projects like rooftop solar panels and those locally managed grids, they're gaining some traction. Old Post even did a report on how these community projects are improving energy independence and resilience, especially in rural areas that are often neglected.
So it's about giving people the power to control their own energy production instead of depending on a centralized system that's prone to failing, like we're seeing now.
Exactly. And international collaboration could also play a role. Al Jazeera reported that countries like Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, and even Russia have offered to help Cuba with the blackout and maybe even modernizing their grid.
It's good to see that there's at least some potential for cooperation, even amidst this crisis.
It is. And it brings us to a key point for our listeners. What's happening in Cuba isn't an isolated event. It reflects the struggles that many nations are facing, dealing with old infrastructure, the urgent need to switch to renewable energy, and the growing impacts of climate change.
It definitely makes you think about our own energy consumption and how resilient our systems are. And if we have a long-term vision that puts people and the environment first.
Absolutely. Cuba's situation shows us that energy security isn't just a technical issue. It's connected to history, politics, economics, and even the resilience of the human spirit.
It makes you wonder, can Cuba, with all these difficulties, actually overcome this crisis and build a more sustainable future? What do you think?
I don't think there's an easy answer. But amidst all the problems, there are signs of innovation and resourcefulness. The question is, can they use these strengths and find the support they need to build a more resilient energy system?
So we've talked about what's happening right now in Cuba and all the things that are contributing to this blackout. But to really get to the bottom of this crisis, we need to go back even further, right?
Yeah, I think so. Cuba's energy story is really tied up with its political and economic history. To understand what's going on now, we need to look at how those forces have shaped their energy landscape.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock a bit. Where should we start?
Well, like we talked about before, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a huge turning point for Cuba, especially in terms of energy. Before that, they had this steady supply of cheap oil from the Soviets.
Right, and that all ended in the early 90s.
Exactly. When the Soviet Union fell apart, Cuba lost its main source of energy. They entered this period of extreme economic hardship that they called the special period. Imagine a country used to affordable fuel suddenly facing widespread shortages and constant blackouts.
That must have been incredibly tough on the Cuban people.
It was. They had to adapt really quickly. They started rationing, put in place energy conservation measures, and even began experimenting with alternative energy sources like biofuels and wind power. They also turned inward, promoting things like urban farming and a culture of resourcefulness.
It sounds like they're really trying to break free from relying on outside sources.
They were, but that transition was slow and it was full of challenges. The infrastructure was outdated, investment was scarce, and they didn't have a lot of technical expertise.
And then, as we discussed earlier, the tightening of the U.S. embargo in recent years just made their economic problems worse.
Exactly. The embargo restricted their access to international markets and financing, which made it even harder to modernize their energy infrastructure.
So it's like this perfect storm of challenges. They had this dependence on the Soviet Union, then they suddenly lost that support, they have the ongoing embargo, and on top of all that, they need to transition to more sustainable energy sources.
It is, and this current blackout has really brought all these interconnected issues to the surface.
But even with all these obstacles, we've also talked about some positive things happening, right? Like there's a growing interest in community-based energy solutions and the potential for international cooperation.
Right, and those are important to highlight. Cuba has shown incredible resilience throughout its history, and they've always been willing to adapt and come up with new solutions. The question is, can they use these strengths to build a more sustainable and energy-secure future for themselves?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? What does the future hold for Cuba's energy landscape?
It's hard to say for sure, but the choices they make now will have a huge impact. Will they be able to speed up the transition to renewable energy? Can they attract the investment and expertise they need to modernize their infrastructure? And how will the geopolitical situation affect their options?
These are all important questions, and they remind us that energy security isn't just a Cuban issue, it's a global one.
Absolutely. As the world tries to move towards a more sustainable energy future, Cuba's experience offers some valuable lessons. It shows us how important it is to diversify our energy sources, to
Mhm.
plan for the long term, and to recognize how energy security, economic development, and political stability are all connected.
Well said. I think that's a great place to wrap things up. Cuba's situation is complex, but it gives us insights that go way beyond their borders.
I agree. It reminds us that we all have a responsibility to create a more sustainable and equitable energy future for ourselves and for future generations.
So as we end this deep dive, we want to leave you with this thought. What can we learn from Cuba's journey with energy? How does it affect our own choices and policies when it comes to energy? It's something to consider as we face the challenges and opportunities of this changing energy landscape. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive